I don't feel alone. We just settled in and it already feels like home.
You're listening to the Feels Like Home podcast with Mike Throne and Marty Ford. Powered by Horizon. This is big. This is gig.
Welcome back, everybody, to Feels Like Home. This is Mike. And today, I'm going to ask for your indulgence on something. I need you to listen today. So our guest this week is the Reverend Terry Williams. And I think it's not out of the realm of possibility that you probably think that Terry could be a somewhat polarizing figure in our community. But Marty and I both agree this conversation is a very, very important one that we have tonight, and one that we feel is at the right time. And so we're really asking for your indulgence to listen to the whole thing. I think what I love about Terry is how passionate he is about Chillicothe and about how passionate he is for the people that are underserved in our community and rejected in our community. And I think it makes for a very, very interesting conversation. So the pastor of Orchard Hill Church of Christ, the Reverend Terry Williams. We are very excited to welcome the Reverend Terry Williams with us. He's the pastor of Orchard Hill United Church of Christ. I always just usually said UCC. Mm-hmm. And as I was saying United Church of Christ, I was literally fact-checking myself. So I welcome you. And Marty, welcome.
Yeah, welcome.
Well, it's great to be here, guys. I really appreciate your work on the podcast, and it's great to be here on the podcast now.
So a couple of different reasons why I wanted you to be on. Number one, if I'm going to introduce you to the rest of our audience that may not know you yet, it's got to be a small percentage. But if on the haphazard chance that it might happen, I will say that there is no social justice warrior in Chillicothe like Terry Williams. Is that a fair assessment?
Maybe I don't know. I just like to think of myself as a normal person who gets upset at the things you ought to get upset at. But I know there are a lot of people who don't share that assessment. So I'll take your word for it.
Because on your Twitter or on your Facebook bio, it says disrupts injustice by following Jesus.
Absolutely. And
you've been a pastor for how long?
I've been a pastor here in Chillicothe. This is my 10th year, and I've been in ministry for 15 years with the United Church of Christ.
And you're originally a Southern Ohio boy, born and raised in Waverly.
Born and raised in Waverly. I like to tell people I'm born outside of Waverly, right? I'm over near Beaver. We're in the hills. So, okay. Yeah. Chillicothe's really the big city, right, compared to where I grew up. And people laugh about that, but going to Chillicothe was a big deal as a child, right? Like for our culture, my grandparents would pile in the car and we'd come up to Woolworths and spend the day, get new church shirts at Penny's, go to the Bob Evans, typically for a little bit of food on the way home. It was a big trip. And now we just drive that all the time, right. Back and forth. So.
Yeah. And I assume, because of the role that you have in being a pastor, I assume that you grew up in the church and had an awakening at some point that pastoral work was what you wanted to do.
I grew up in the Christian Union, and it was a fantastic experience as a child. I tell people we were in church 8 days a week, and that's pretty much true. You have not just Sunday morning, but Sunday evening. You have midweek meetings and that kind of process. But I grew up with a father who was a pastor and an excellent pastor. And he was an excellent pastor because it was who he was and still is. He still pastors, Grandview Christian Union Church down in Pike County. But I can remember thinking, oh, Lord, I do not want to be in this work, because you have people contacting you all times, day and night. You're in just about every single community space that you're in. You are kind of the institutional person there. For people, and that just as a child I can remember thinking this does not appeal to me, and I went away to college, and lo and behold, your gifts come out no matter what. I ended up being kind of that pastoral person for my friend group and for folks in college, and eventually ended up in a place where I couldn't deny my call to seminary, my call to caring for other people. It really was that kind of experience of coming around full circle to realize that this work is not something you choose, it's something that chooses you.
Yeah. And obviously, I think you went to Ohio Wesleyan, is that correct?
Yes,
yeah.
yes, Ohio Wesleyan in Delaware.
And then you went to the Methodist Theological Seminary up there, right?
Yeah, I like to tell people I was educated not only in undergrad and graduate school, but also my nursery school was in a Methodist church. But I am not United Methodist. I love United Methodists, great potlucks, but I'm a member of the United Church of Christ. Right? They have a UCC House of Studies there at the Methodist Theological School, so we have a pretty good contingent of the United Church of Christ. And some people say, well, are you the Church of Christ? Are you the, non-instrumental? Are you the, and I have to remind people we're the UCC. We're the merger of what is the Congregational Christian Church, or the Pilgrims originally, and the Evangelical Reformed Church. The congregation here in Chillicothe was First Evangelical Reformed, eventually became St. John's ENR, and they've been here in Chillicothe as a continuing presence since 1833. Wow. So I like to tell people I'm just here for a season because, there's work that goes on before us and long after we're gone. We get to hold it for a moment, though.
Yeah. And it's interesting to me that as I think about it, Church of Christ and Christian Union, Wesleyan School, Methodist Seminary, and then Church of UCC, which is really, really interesting to me. And so, what gravitates you? What gravitates you at some point toward the UCC faith to actually pastor a church?
Well, a big part of my faith journey, going to Ohio Wesleyan, my initial major at Wesleyan was biochemistry. And I spent significant time in study with chemistry. I'm actually a Ralph E. Hall Fellow of Chemistry at Ohio Wesleyan.
Well, that makes two of us. No, I'm kidding.
Wonderful, right? But for me, the study of science in particular, and science is a pathway to understand the natural world and thereby to understand God more deeply, is really an essential part of my upbringing. That we were taught that God's first gift to us is conscience, and God's second gift to us are our senses. So the ability to discern and really, that Christian Union identity of we will discern for ourselves. We make discernment in our own conscience, and following the dictates of our conscience is essential. That drove me when I was in college to really seek a conscience-loving church. And the United Church of Christ, for me in Little Delaware, Ohio, my home church, I call it Zion, Mother Zion, we call it, Zion UCC in Delaware, is a congregation filled with people who disagree about absolutely everything imaginable, right? We're a non-creedal church, so we don't have a creed that you all must sign, that you all must agree to. We have one fellowship, and that is to follow Jesus. With the dictates of our conscience and the care and compassion of, the light that is revealed to us in Christ. So when I found that group of believers, when I found those folk who didn't say, you can't be a part of us because you're not like us, folk who would say, you're not like us, we find that fascinating. We see God in you in a way we haven't seen in other people, in other places. Come, be a part. That was profound for me. So a church that values diversity, and a church that takes the Bible so seriously that it doesn't take the Bible literally. To interrogate Scripture, to look at how Scripture is essential and alive within our work, but it is also not something that can be distilled to, little pithy aphorisms. It's something that must be struggled with. That really is what drove me to be at home in the United Church of Christ. And as a faith, we like to tell people our faith is 2,000 years old. Our thinking is not, We are open and affirming in so many ways around people's identities, their social constructs, Many people know that, our congregation here in Chillicothe has been open and affirming of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender persons since 1999. And that's a dictate that we took not because it's a good social position or because, we took a poll and figured out that that'd be nice, but because we really believe that these particular people who have been maligned in many places and in many spaces are children of God, and they ought to be widely accepted not only in the life of the church, but in leadership. Our positions also around women and egalitarianism. Women are ministers in our churches. My superior in the United Church of Christ, if you will, my association minister, is a fantastic woman who's been in ministry for a long period. We just feel that some of those social issues should not be issues. They should be opportunities for us to come together and embrace the diversity that we have before us. So, the UCC accepted me as an openly gay man. It accepted me as an Appalachian. It accepted me as a man who loves Cincinnati Reds and bacon way too much, right? Like all of my vices are accepted by the UCC, and they allow me to work on myself while I'm there too, right?
Yeah.
It's Jesus will love you as you are and never leave you as you were,
Yeah. I would note, and then you brought up the social issues and things like that. You are on the board of Faith Choice Ohio. Mm-hmm. And then I think you also, I'm not sure exactly if you're on the board there, but Faith in Public Life is another group that you work with.
Yeah. So to be clear, I'm not on the board of Faith Choice Ohio. I'm actually a faith organizer with Faith Choice Ohio.
Very good. Okay.
And for those who aren't familiar, Faith Choice Ohio is Ohio's faithful voice for reproductive choice. So reproductive health rights and justice. We are an abortion positive faith organization uniting lots of different faith groups and lots of different folks, not only around positivity for abortion and abortion care, but also positivity for reproductive justice. That is the ability to choose when to have children, when not to have children, and how to parent children that you have in sustainable and safe communities. So kind of a holistic process. I'm also a clergy coordinator, somewhat of a smaller role with Faith in Public Life. So we work with Faith in Public Life, those of us who are coordinators around the state, to help local clergy get involved in local social issues that are of particular import. So we've done a lot of work around particularly bail reform, also Narcan, naloxone distribution, harm reduction, that kind of process. And, somewhat less controversial, a lot of Faith in Public Life's work has been about ecumenical care, building bridges between particularly Jewish synagogues and mosques for our Muslim brothers and sisters when those places have been under threat. We're a very Christian-heavy space in Ohio, and our sisters and brothers of other faiths, particularly Jews and Muslims in Ohio, face a very, very negative atmosphere from a very small group of people in our state. And we like at Faith Public Life, we like to show up for those people in positive ways. So when there are threats against a mosque or threats against a synagogue, we show up, we show out, and typically outdoors with positive signs. We reach out to the people who are in those communities, particularly the clergy, to try to help strengthen their idea that they're not alone, that we are in this together.
Yeah. One of the things that you did for Faith in Public Life, it was just a small snippet, but you recorded something for National Coming Out Day last year. And I'm going to be honest with you, I watched it a couple of times and it moved me. I thought it was a very well done description from a faith perspective and from on a human level of how to celebrate that moment for somebody. Period. Not even, let's just take the faith aspect out of it. Let's take just on a human level. I felt like it, for those of you that haven't seen it, maybe we can drop a link to it in the bio when we post this. But I think it just, as somebody that has never had to face that or have to really even counsel someone through that, I could literally show that to folks and say, this is kind of how you become affirming and how you become open. And I just wanted to say that because I felt like it was just such a great moment, not only for you, but I think for folks who on that day were making some very crucial decisions with something very, very personal. that they wanted to show to other people. And I'm sure, I know in my past, when I was growing up, we didn't have things like that. And there were friends that I had that I knew were gay, and we didn't talk about it. Right. It was the Bruno in the room. We don't talk about it. Right. Yeah. And I always, after the fact, felt for them because you could never be who you really were.
Yeah.
And so I hope that that's, your approach on this, I think, is hopefully something that will be emulated by many others.
Well,
this is big. Verizon Fiber Internet is ready.
Let them get you hooked up and power your Wi-Fi network
with the speed and reliability that only a 100% fiber network can do.
Verizon is ready to help you do what you do better. With real people, real rates, and a real service.
Connect with them today, and the first month is free, plus no contracts and no data caps. Call 740-772-8331
or visit horizonconnects.com/Chillicothe to sign up today.
That really is our hope, because I got to tell you, Mike, for me, growing up in Waverly, Ohio, that was not a part of my experience. As an openly gay person, I was not able to be open, and I was not really able to articulate who I was within that context, even, 15, 20 years ago. And there's been such a transformation between that era and now in terms of how our youth and young adults are empowered to own their identity, and not just parts of their identity, but their whole identity.
Yes.
I get a little worried when, we start hearing the political talk about, we don't want to talk about divisive concepts, or, we're worried about, there was this incident in Huntington that, lots of commentary on that
sure
we could say for another day. But I think it's
fascinating.
We'll yeah, I think it's fascinating that we're in a place where our culture is beginning to ask the question, like, when is it okay to share this part of who you are?
Right.
And our youth and young adults, they know who they are, right? And the question isn't whether or not they're going to know how to share it with you. It's whether or not you're going to demonstrate that you're a safe person for them to share with. Because they are who they are, whether you know it or not.
Right.
I tell people this all the time, regardless of the social issue that you have, people are in those positions, whether you know it or not, right? There are people who are gay and lesbian, whether they tell you or not, who are your friends. You're already, your friends, some of your family members, right? The same goes for any other social issue. There are people who use drugs who are your friends and your family members, whether they tell you or not. There are people who have had abortions who are your friends and your family members, whether they trust you enough to share that story or not. And the question doesn't, come down to, well, how can I keep people from being whatever this is, or engaging in whatever this way is, or, having this identity? The question is, do these people trust you enough to share their story with you and to invite you into their true life, their true living?
Yeah.
And for me, a lot of people say, oh, he's so loud, he's so, boisterous about things. I wish he'd shut up about things. That my mother feels the same way.
You care way too much about principle and process was something that you wrote that somebody said to you, right?
I had a conversation recently about a city council matter, as a matter of fact, and that was the phrase, you care too much about principle and process. And the fact of the matter is, I don't think there'd be a single person in my close inner circle, my very close friends, my family, who would disagree with that. And I don't disagree with that. It's who I am, right?
Yeah,
I mean, you don't get a degree in biblical studies, for nothing, right? Caring about, every jot and tittle, it's kind of partial, to that life. But I think the essential part for me is that I stopped being quiet about things that mattered to me. And I am willing to fight with anybody in a good sense, to struggle principally, right? Not violently, but to struggle in a principled way over things that matter. Because I think there are things that matter in our culture and our local community that we ought to be willing to fight for.
Yeah.
You know, we ought to be willing to fight for these kids to be able to have access to the kinds of space and safety that they need to be who they are. Right? We ought to be able to fight for, good access to medical care for people who need medical treatment. You know, some of the work that we've talked about around harm reduction, right? I think about naloxone. Like, we fought for a long while to even get naloxone to be available, because my position is, again, not being a person who uses drugs, my drug of choice is typically the Edie's ice cream, right? Like, I mean, that's how this works, right? Being fat's not illegal yet. So the process, though, ends up being that folk have that experience as a person who uses drugs, and they either get to live another day to make different choices or more, robust choices, or they don't.
Right.
And so for us, I think as a community, it's worth fighting for that extra day, even if, you're tired, even if you're weary about it, even if it costs us a lot of money or a lot of investment, to be able to give people another day to make another choice and to have another opportunity.
Yeah.
Right? That's just essential. So creating those spaces, I think, is part of our social holiness, to use a Wesleyan phrase, right?
Yeah, that's very much a Wesleyan phrase.
Yeah.
I'm really intrigued. Part of the reason why I ended up, so we always ignore what's under our nose sometimes. In this case, I ignored what was above my head. So in all honesty, Terry rents the apartment literally above my office at the chamber. And I had to read an article in Columbus Alive to think, oh man, I should have Terry on the podcast, because it was an amazing article about the work that you do to help people collectively grieve and fight for the living when it comes to drug addiction and losing people, frankly, from that. Tell me how you got started in that, and describe a little bit about what you do, because I probably did not. I inadequately described it, I think. So the article that you're referencing was written by Jack Schuler, who is a fantastic guy out of Denison University. As much as it pains me as an Ohio Wesleyan guy to praise anything that comes from Denison, Jack Schuler's really a great guy. Been writing a lot about the opioid epidemic and the greater overdose epidemic, as things have shifted away from opioids. And Jack got wind through a couple of people that they said, we went to this service, this after service that Reverend Williams did. You ought to go talk to him. So Jack calls me up, and Jack and I have worked on a lot of projects together, just me helping basically, get him access to other people. And he called me up and said, hey, I talked to some folk. I heard about the, could I come down and interview? And I said, well, I'll talk to anybody, right? I mean, I'm a pastor. That, right?
How many hours do you got,
yeah.
right? I mean, because we're here. So, and Jack came down to listen to the story. And I didn't really think about, until Jack initiated that process. Frankly, I didn't think anything about the work that I have done as being all that extraordinary or novel, I guess would be the better term. Because it's just what we do. But Jack was like, wow, how many of these have you done? We got into the discussion, and, he said, we need to write this up. So for me, part of what is shared in that article is that I do some pastoral care work, and particularly additional worship services or funeral services in particular for people after a person has died and there has been a funeral because of overdose. There are often times where these individuals who have died, their families don't want their old friends around, because there's pain, there's anxiety, there's frustration, all the things that go into any funeral, right? People are grieving. My very first year here in Chillicothe, it was early spring 2013. I had a couple of folks come to church on a Sunday, and they stayed a little after, and they they stay long. They stay to the back of the line, and preachers, we can stand and talk all day at the door of the church, right? I mean, we're there, might as well just bring us the fried chicken and we'll stay all day, right? So you knew that these folk had something they wanted to share because they were lagging behind. They didn't want, anybody else to be around. And when finally, most everyone had gotten out of the narthex of the church, they came up and said, "Hey," he said, we really appreciate your sermon, and we were wondering if you'd be willing to do a funeral service for us. And I said, "Well, gosh," I said, "I just met you, but sure. I mean, I'm always here. What kind of a funeral is it?" And they said, "Well, it's a funeral without a body." And then they sat down and began to, tell their story. They had this dear friend who was a drug user with them, and they admitted that they were still actively using drugs. And this individual had used drugs alone. And they felt tremendous sadness at that because they tried to care for one another and to be with each other when they used. And he'd gotten a hold of a bad batch of, opioids at that point. What we now understand, was likely a fentanyl-laced batch of stuff because, this stuff gets cut with all kinds of junk. And it didn't know how it would affect him and overdosed in that process. So you ended up in a situation where he died, and the family just did not even want to admit that this had happened. They wrote up the obituary in such a way that it did not, indicate anything, like an overdose. They didn't mention overdose at the funeral. The funeral was held in a local funeral home, and the funeral folk were the ones who told these people when they came, and the family said, "We'd really like you not to be here." The funeral director was the one who said, "Hey, how about you check out this church down here, because they've helped us out with other things in the past." And I found out at that point that our congregation had this kind of long history of having those kinds of services for those kind of folk during the AIDS pandemic locally. A woman by the name of Mary Rutledge was a lay member who had been very active in, Adina Women's Board and other things. And she had really, gotten together with some of the ministers who were there at the church and said, we need to have services for these people who were dying of AIDS, and their families either weren't, caring for them or didn't want to claim their bodies. So that heritage led to this interaction with, a funeral director that led these people to me. And I had never experienced that request before. Can you do a funeral for somebody who's already had a funeral? And when we finally started talking about, well, who would you want to have there at the funeral? It was the same thing that I do with, any grieving family. What do you want? How can we best honor this person? We ended up devising a plan to invite this person's, friend group to gather at the grave, right? And we gathered, had reading of several scriptures. I'm a liturgical Christian, so we have a book for that, right? We open up the book. We have, and the liturgy is something for us to lean on. To where we don't have to recreate the wheel. We have all these wonderful prayers and words from history, and then we get to allow God to reach through and touch the moment, right? And I remember that very first service, I retold the story of Lazarus, and that has become my go-to in so many ways, right? Because you have this story in Scripture of Lazarus being, one who has died, and Jesus is late coming to Lazarus, and, Martha gets this, really frustrating interaction with Jesus. If you'd only been here, my brother would have, not died, would have been, still with us. And it kind of gets at a lot of the emotions, right, that are at play in all of these people, in all of these places. And even though as we stood around, I had to say, my faith is such that I believe in the resurrection. I do not believe that God is going to resuscitate your friend here today. I don't believe he's going to be like, land of the dead coming up out of the ground. I do believe he is gone this day, but he is present with us in spirit and will be present with us in our living. And that is the beginning of the resurrection, in my opinion. I believe that how we live now, based upon those who have gone on, that's how we carry people in life throughout this process of the rest of our lives. And after that service was done, at the time, I had a supply of naloxone. Now, I did not have that supply of naloxone, I will say, through the most legitimate of means. But we had that supply of naloxone there. I will not indicate how we had it there, but we had it there. We also had, I had packets made up frankly, from the health department. I called the health department and said, do you have any literature? I didn't tell them how I was distributing it, but, they gave me lots of information about, where are the local rehabilitation centers, where are the NA groups meeting. And we got to sit and talk with people afterwards and just say, we love you. We care deeply about you. We want to make sure that you are not here in the next week, month, year. And really had a deep bonding experience. And I thought that was going to be it. Right. I thought this was a one-off. This was how it was. And it turned into just like, weddings. You do one wedding and 3 people at the wedding go, that was a great sermon. We got to have him do our wedding. Right.
Yeah.
Only, unfortunately, it's a much less happy occasion where you have people who, because of where we live and how much loss there is in this region, it just grew from there. To the point that, I have done many of these services. I went through with Jack and started looking, and, it's been over 100 in wow. this county and the region. In 10 years, it equals out. You think about last year alone in our county, the new numbers came out. It's 64 overdose deaths in Ross County. That's more than double the rate of our whole state. Our whole state had more than 5,200 overdose deaths in 2021. And that puts us right at 4th in the nation. Yeah. Right? We're behind, I think, West Virginia, Delaware, and Kentucky are the 3 states that have a higher per capita than we do in terms of overdose deaths in Ohio. It is unfortunately a growing problem. Right. And the struggle, though, out of all the statistics is that it is a growing grief because every one of those numbers, every one of those 64 folks have left behind a swath of grieving people who are either getting their grief out and working through their grief, or they are pushing it inward and welling it up. Yeah. And, that's the struggle, that you end up in a situation where, if you just keep jamming the grief down and piling it under, it's not good for the whole family. It's not good for all of the people that individual touches. It's not good for the people who, could otherwise be, making choices for their life that could lead them in a different place.
Well, and if you're someone that has trouble with substances in the first place, that could be a big trigger to put you right back where you were, right? And start using again and maybe end up in the same spot where either you overdose or you die. And we don't need any more of that.
And I think the human connection piece, right, is the essential element. People say, people who use drugs, they need to have treatment. They need to have inpatient. They need to have, the court needs to order this, that. The reality is these folk are lacking in only one thing, and that is deep relationships in the community. Their ability to build strong friendships, strong friend group relationships, strong relationships with institutions like, churches and civic organizations and their families. Those are the things that are going to help people long term more than anything else. Yeah. And we've been in a place for so long where we have tried all the punitive stuff, right? We've tried the war on drugs and the just say no and the lock folks up and, all of this heavy-handed punitive measures. You'd think after 40 years of that, if it worked, it'd be working, right? And the reality is it's not working. And what does work is actually building relationships to, with, and for people, and investing in people, right?
Yeah.
Investing in people's wellness, investing in people's long-term security, investing in people's, their upbringing in this community, that they need space to be and to be safely who they are.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, what occurs to me about that is, I think as a community in that 2013 to 2015 era is when we started to figure that out. When we started to think we're not just going to sit by and let people just drop off and not even think a second thought about it. What can we do? And, locally, I think we developed a conscience about it. Like, why are we just letting people die? And I think, it's really when I think even in my own life, I said, why do I just report on all the deaths and not try to do anything about it? And so that's when we started to report differently and do things differently. And I think, collectively we came up with a new approach to this thing, and it was going to be local. It wasn't going to be Save Us Washington, Save Us Columbus. It was going to be, Chillicothe is going to take care of its own.
Absolutely.
And, that's when the post-overdose response team came up and, other things like that. Naloxone became more of a prevalent thing. It didn't have to be a bad thing to get that. In fact, it was a good thing. And so I think, that's it's really interesting because I knew nothing of that story before I read Jack's article. And then you see it paralleling the time frame when we were doing a lot of other things. And you're just thinking, I don't know about you, but I thought, God was really at work in that.
Yeah.
Whether it's through you or through John Gabus or through, Michelle McAllister and Terry Minnie and the people, and even with the changing the hearts and minds of law enforcement, we now literally in this town have a social worker on staff at the police department, which is, not something we've ever had. So, these are all things that have changed as our mindset, which means we always evolve, right? We have to, because things change. And I think that's important.
I have a saying that my church people already know what I'm going to say. So apologies to all of you.
You can say it along with them if you're listening.
Yeah, I'm just saying, but this is church speak right now. So anybody who is rooted in the church, you'll understand this analogy. But I like to tell people there are some things that can happen in Bethlehem that can't happen in Jerusalem. Right? In our tradition, we hold that Christ was born in Bethlehem, was born in this very relatively small town. It was not the smallest. It was, the big city for people around, but it was definitely not Jerusalem. And I like to tell people things can happen in Bethlehem that can't happen in Jerusalem, because I truly believe, and it's one of the reasons that I, came back to this region and came to Chillicothe. I believe things can happen in Chillicothe and Ross County that cannot happen in places that are too much smaller or too much larger in terms of population, in terms of resources. We're in that sweet spot, that Goldilocks spot, where we have a town that is small enough that it feels like everybody kind of knows everybody else, but we are large enough that we have the ability to collaborate and really get that extra value added from innovation in ways that aren't hampered by the big city politics.
Yeah.
I mean, I say that in kind of a hopeful way, right? I mean, we all see the dysfunction that happens in Columbus and in Washington, D.C. Under no circumstance would I ever want to reproduce those things in this space. We also see some of our very, very small towns surrounding. I think of my hometown of Waverly, great people, fantastic folk, and they are struggling because the resources just aren't necessarily there. It hasn't hit the critical mass yet, right? We in this space have the ability to enjoy that critical mass and also that connective community that makes transformation possible, and it makes it happen.
Yeah.
The idea that we do have that social worker available in this space, funded by, tax dollars, doing the work that we know by, tons of studies and focus groups and, people with expertise can tell you that social worker is worth every dime and dollar, because the work that's being done is going to get done one way or the other, whether it's done by somebody who's equipped to do it or whether it's done by someone who is not equipped to do it but is forced to do the work anyway.
Yeah.
Those kind of solutions, that's where our future is going to thrive. It's not in waiting for somebody else to come and do things for us. It's not in, waiting for someone to come in with the next new consultant or the, new batch of stuff. We are uniquely equipped in this moment to be able to be our own best friends when it comes to the new solutions that have to happen in the space.
Yeah. I really appreciate your work on that. I really do. I think it's very, very important for, we have some good faith leaders that have really rallied around the addiction community. But I don't know anybody doing things in the space that you're in where it's sort of like this after the fact thing where people that aren't allowed to grieve are allowed to grieve. And that's very, very important. I think equally important, I mentioned at the beginning, social justice is very important to you. And so I remember you being on the forefront of the short-lived discussion of the anti-discrimination ordinance in Chillicothe, and when same-sex marriage was finally legalized and certain courts were making decisions on not to do things, you were involved heavily in that as well. And again, I think you put it really well. You care about the things that sometimes people think we shouldn't care about. And I even look at the health board situation right now. What do you feel like you've kind of become a person that people expect you to speak out about the controversial issues, or even, I think you put it earlier, like this shouldn't be controversial, but it is. And so I'm going to speak out about it.
So I like to tell people that, when it comes to political positions or social positions, I work very hard to occupy the loony left, okay? Because I consider myself to be a progressive. I'm the son of two union laborers. I am the child of, grandparents who worked the railroad strikes in the 1920s and fought hard for progressive wages, that progress. I think of myself as an Appalachian radical when I'm in spaces beyond this space because, I go to Columbus and people don't know what to do with, long-term union progressives in Columbus because it's like, oh my God, you're you own 4 shotguns and a handgun and you're still a Democrat. I don't understand that, right? But having to communicate to people that there are bigger things beyond the binary of red, blue, up, down, yes, no. Right. I hold progressive values because I want the ability to make choices for my own life that are consistent with my values, and I don't want to begrudge other people that, right? So when I hear people, ask about a situation or a social question, there are a lot of people who at this point will call me up and say, what do you think about that? And what they're really saying is, how much of a window of possibility is there on this? I feel like I am one side of the window of possibility in this community in many ways, that people kind of look to me and some other voices that I cavort around with as, well, what is the edge, right? Because I know that I am in the minority on a great number of things because there are very few people who are as far, to my side of the spectrum as I am. I find it fascinating, though, when folks try to tag other people with that same moniker, because I almost get a little offended, that it's like, well, I worked real hard to be this far out on the line, right? You mentioned the health board conversation. I heard a couple of people, in that discussion talk about the nominees that were up. John Gabus and Seal Corcoran talked about them and said, oh, they're far left radicals. And I had to laugh because the only times that I have ever gotten into disagreements, around anti-discrimination ordinance was with Seal Corcoran, because she was too to the middle of the road compared to me. I wanted them to pass something right now, and her argument was, no, we need to wait for a comprehensive solution because we don't want it to be patchwork county to county. We want a statewide solution.
Right.
Only time that I've really, disagreed with John Gabus on things is when I've been farther to the left than he was. You talk about birth control access. You talk about abortion issues. He's very much pro-life and wants that. He wants that middle of the road place. So when people try to lump me together with all of those folk, I really wonder how discerning people are being first about like how our policies are. But I also wonder if people have taken the time to really listen to people.
Right.
Because for me, I am a progressive, but I do not demand that everybody agrees with me. Right.
Right.
My grandmother used to say, everybody's got a right to be wrong, especially your grandfather, right? and I feel like that's a good place for us to start from when we think about any social issue, any political issue, that it's okay for folk to be quote unquote wrong or to disagree with you. In the end, we have to agree how to live together, right? So I see myself more as the person who is able to articulate what I believe ought to be our reality. And if that's not shared by a great number of people, that's all right.
Yeah.
I'm still going to be the gadfly out of the corner saying, Judge Street and Judge Eddy should not have decided to just stop doing weddings so that they could avoid marrying same-sex couples. I'm going to stand up and say we really should have passed a non-discrimination ordinance, and I think it's fascinating that we had 7 Democrats out of 9 positions on council, and they still wouldn't do that. If that doesn't tell you about political diversity in Chillicothe, I don't think anything will. But, I am a lifelong holder of minority opinions, and I expect that to continue.
Yeah.
I am also a lifelong holder of compassion for people who completely disagree with me. Because I'll tell you the beautiful part about this town and the beautiful part about these people, regardless of where you are, I have yet to meet a single person in this town who I don't believe has the interests of this town at heart. They may find completely different ways to express that, and they may absolutely drive me insane in the way that they go about it. But at the end of the day, you cannot question the commitment of people in this town to the good of the town. The question is how we get there.
Right.
Right. And I can't say that about every other place I've been. I cannot say that about Columbus, Ohio.
Right.
I genuinely cannot say that about, some of the people that we have in the state and national legislature. I can say that about Chillicothe and Ross County.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree with that. It's part of the reason why I've stayed here for almost 25 years. In all honesty, if I didn't feel that way, I would have been gone after 3, and so I think I think the really interesting thing today is we have never had the ability to communicate better than we can today, but we listen probably as less as we've ever have, right? As little as we've ever have. And I think, we can sit here and have 3 divergent opinions amongst the 3 people sitting around this table. But if we all talked about it together, we'd probably find some things about each opinion that we could say, you know what, I get that. It feels like there's not as many people doing that because of all the noise,
I think for me, I see the same thing at play, and I'd put slightly a different cast on it. I feel like we have gotten to a point to where we have the ability to communicate, but we're not communicating. We're just talking. And a large part of that talking is centered around trying to persuade other people to hold our opinions.
Yeah. Right. Yep.
And I cannot, I talk through mediation situations all the time, right? As a pastor, you're always called into mediation, whether it's helping people in marital counseling, helping people, talk through problems at work, other issues. You cannot be an effective mediator unless you understand what people value. And if you don't listen to what people value, you're never going to be able to have a conversation because you're constantly talking past each other. That's where we are in our culture. I believe our political discourse. We have gotten into these polling, research, talking points, 3 things that are going to win me points and get me the advantage. And we just hammered those home. And we don't actually listen to each other and listen to what our values are, right? My granddad used to say, and I'm going to clean this up a little bit for you because he was a rail worker, right? But people would get angry at him in many settings in the railroad because he would call out things that people just didn't want to talk about. He'd call out, early on the racism of segregated rail cars and sleeper cars. He'd call out issues of pay disparity, right? And he used to tell people, he said, turning the light on didn't put crap on the barn floor. He didn't say crap, right? But turning the light on didn't put crap on the barn floor. This idea that if you turn the lights on in a barn and the floor is a mess, the floor didn't get to be a mess because you turned the light on, right? The floor was a mess before you knew it, before you turned the light on and saw it. In our culture, I think we have left the lights off and we're wondering why it smells so bad, right? As a culture, we aren't listening to each other. We aren't engaging each other authentically in so many ways. And we're wondering why we're in the dark and we're wondering why it smells so bad. We've got to turn on the lights and then we've got to get to cleaning the mess up.
Yeah.
And I've got to say, it's easy to pontificate about, things of this nature, but I would like to share with your grace a story. Many folk know that I occasionally pen letters to the editor, right?
Yes. I think I'm familiar.
Mike knows this because he was the editor here for a while. And I remember a particular situation where I was really, really angry, right? And I try not to write a letter when I'm really angry, but I went overboard and did it. You know exactly what I'm going to talk about, too.
I do.
So I wrote this letter. I won't name the person, but it was a member of city council had taken a position that I just felt was absolutely feckless. I was mad, and I was not listening. I was completely entrenched in my system, my perspective. I wrote the letter, and I have this policy where since that time I have been able to hold to this. I write a letter and I physically write it out and I put it in my desk. And I come back the next day for it. I didn't come back the next day. I didn't even proofread the thing, right? I sent it off and I hit send to Mike. And you remember your response to me, right?
I do.
You said, I can't run this. And I don't think you really want to be saying this. And I felt in that moment, right? I felt in that moment and that reflection, there was this community care, right? It was like when a person's been at the bar and had one too many, and the barkeep comes over and goes, buddy, can we call you a cab, right? Yeah. We all need that kind of experience in our lives, right? No matter who we are, right? Because I guarantee if that letter had been printed or even gotten out, I mean, if you had shared that letter around and said, obviously you never would have, but, had that happened, there would have been a lot of harm done by that because we're not always our best selves. Right?
Yep.
And we need a community that can hold us in our good times and in our rough times.
Yep.
Yeah. We need that. So I feel like the more we have a connected community that can hold us in our less than pristine moments, the better we are.
Yeah. Obviously, being an openly queer pastor in Southern Ohio, as you see things like the introduction of a Don't Say Gay bill, it's probably not the best way to phrase that, even though it's pretty much what it is. And then you referenced earlier the situation with the local school district here at Huntington, where the openly gay, substitute teacher is basically asked to not come back anymore. Obviously, you hold your sexuality is very important to you. It's who you are. You have this ability to succinctly, I think, sometimes say the things that people think, but they don't necessarily know how to articulate. How do you work inside the framework to try to achieve change when these things happen?
So I think the first piece of that is I disquiet a lot of people just by showing up as who I am. Okay.
I've actually literally seen this happen.
Well, and I didn't fully appreciate that until, a few years ago, really being conscious of what happens when you show up in a space. But I think one of my great gifts is that I'm really bad at poker, right? I cannot hide my face. I cannot hide my emotions. And usually what I don't hide on my face also comes out of my mouth, right? I'm going to let people know how I feel about something. Just showing up in some spaces, just the fact that I am an openly queer man who has been in a pulpit in this community for 10 years has changed a lot of conversations. And when I walk into a room, I don't get to be incognito when people are talking about something LGBT.
Even when you grew your hair out long, it didn't work.
I don't get. I mean, it did fool a couple of state legislators. I'm not going to lie.
All right, good.
I did get a meeting with Tim Schaefer's office that I would not have otherwise gotten. But no, I walk into a space, and when the conversation is already slated up to be about something LGBT.
Yeah.
Folk, sometimes will even come over to me and say, "All right, what do you want? Why are you here? What can we do to get this taken care of?" Right? I mean, it become, and I feel kind of bad because I kind of feel like, a hijacker at that point, because sometimes I just show up to meetings and I'm there to listen, and people automatically make the assumption that something's on, right? But just being who we are as queer people in Appalachia offends some people. Mm-hmm. And it angers some people. And it really disappoints some people, because some folk just wish we would go away. And they wish we would not be integral parts of the community. And they wish we would just, no longer exist.
Yeah.
And, this HB 616, the Don't Say Gay bill, it's been introduced by Rep. Mike Loychuk and Gene Schmidt. Some of us had Gene Schmidt as a congressional representative a few years ago, right? Mm-hmm. They've introduced this, I think, because there is this sense of, we want to protect students, we want to protect the educational process, and just not talk about this, right? We're not going to talk about, and that bill specifically lists any divisive concept, and then it specifically lists things like intersectional theory, the 1619 Project, critical race theory. Well, so critical race theory is not something that's taught anywhere in Ross County, right? I mean, we don't have a law school here, so it's not. Intersectional theory is the radical idea that a person can have multiple identities and they can have, an interplay on who they are. For example, you can be a Georgia fan and also, be a fan of what's your favorite baseball team?
Baseball team, the Mets.
Yeah. So you can be a Georgia fan and a Mets fan at the same time, right? That's intersectional theory, right? Mm-hmm. As a queer person in Appalachia, I'm an Appalachian and I'm queer, right? Those two things at the same time. That's intersectional theory. Mm-hmm. It just is, right? So the idea that these bills are coming up that try to protect some sense of not talking about reality, I don't even know how to form words around it, right, when we start talking about it, because what it comes down to is people want to preserve the status quo and the assumptions that already go into that. They don't want to talk about LGBT people and LGBT experience, but they do definitely want to talk about heterosexual experience, and they want to talk about heterosexual identity. So there's this kind of, thinly veiled discrimination on that we just don't want to talk about all of these other things. We want to talk about, little Susie and little Johnny. They look like, their boyfriend and girlfriend, all of this kind of over-sexualization of our children that already happens in culture, right? How many times have you seen people, look at somebody, a 4-year-old, a 3-year-old, and say, "Oh, do you have a boyfriend? Do you have a girlfriend at nursery school?" Like, How weird is that?
Right.
How bizarre is that? We've all seen it. We've all done it at some point, but like we have to name that's really weird. Like that's not that kind of sexualization of children is not normal behavior, and that's not coming from LGBT people, right? That's our culture writ large. Mm-hmm. We have gotten to a point though where we don't want to talk about any of that because we fear the discussion and the discourse. So we hear this, don't talk about divisive concepts. Let me tell you, there are a lot of divisive concepts out there. You want to start defining divisive concepts?
Yeah.
Are we going to start talking about everything that divides a community, right? There are a lot of things that divide this community. There are a lot of things that people just don't agree on, right? Divisive concepts gets to a point to where we're just not going to have any conversation about anything that could remotely lead to somebody changing their mind, which in fact is the whole point of education, right? Education is about learning how to be in community with other people and learning how to discern fact from fiction, right?
Yeah.
So, to get back to the essence of your question though, for me, just showing up as who I am, and being able to live my values in public puts me in a position where, a lot of people will listen and engage and kind of authentically struggle with that perspective. That alone empowers other people. When I came here in, 2012, 2013, we had several school groups throughout, the local high schools that were at the time gay-straight alliances or diversity alliances. And folk asked me to come speak at these groups. And almost universally, when I was invited to come speak at a school group, I would get an invitation, and then about a week later, I would get a call from somebody in the administration. They're like, "We'd like to talk to you before you speak to the children." Okay, all right. What are you going to speak to the children about? And usually, the invitation was, could you come and, talk about what it's like to be an openly queer person, or, what is it like to be religious and LGBT? And it was fascinating to me, the things that administrators were worried, we were going to broach as subjects with children. And it's like, you all know, like I've been authorized by the church, and like I've been well vetted for this. Like, I'm not here to have conversations with your kids about things that you would not have conversations with your kids about, right? But the assumption is placed that somehow as an LGBT person, I am, evangelical about sexuality, or, I am somehow inappropriate. Like, all of that bias starts. And what they don't understand is, like, to be LGBT in Ross County is to go to 50 West and have a West Virginia burger with delicious, apple butter on top of your, and pair that off with a good IPA. Being LGBT in Ross County is getting frustrated that Columbia Gas has, High Street tore up and Church Street tore up, and you're not able to get where you're supposed, right? Like, our experience is not solely about human sexuality. And, I tell people all the time, like, it's really not that different than being who anybody else is in this region. Yeah. Somebody has taken that one part of our identity, though, and made it a marker for whether we are good or bad people, whether we are safe or unsafe people, whether we are holy or unholy people.
Yeah.
And, with the school groups, being able to just be in front of students, and students to say, "Oh, wow, I can be anybody, and that's okay."
Yeah.
Right? I can be in ministry. I can be a teacher and be queer. I can be, a public servant, a public official, and be openly gay.
Yeah.
Or bisexual, transgender. The other piece that always cracks me up, people come to me to talk about transgender issues a lot. I have a lot of folk in my congregation who are either transgender themselves, or they have transgender friends, family members, some non-binary folks. That is not my experience, right? But because of how the culture treats LGBTQIA, the whole alphabet soup thing, like, we all get lumped in together.
Sure.
And people come to me and they say, "So, I have questions about, so as an LGBTQ, I always love it when people phrase it like that, right? As an LGBTQ, whatever, what do you think about, and, bathroom bills, questions about, transgender folk participating in sports, all these other questions. My first question is, I don't know, what do you think?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because that's not who I am. That's not my experience. But somehow I am now the ambassador for all things that are not traditional heterosexuality. Right? And I tell people all the time, I think heterosexual people have an innate advantage to understand transgender experience better than gay people do. Because as gay and lesbian people, we are in a certain way, and we love that way so much we want another one just like it, right?
Right.
Folk who are heterosexual at least know what it's like to be and want something that is different, right? Which is a fundamental experience of being a transgender person, right? Not feeling as if you are in the right physical body, right? That whole process, that's not something that I have a lock on, right? You have to go and really experience lots of different perspectives on. So I do get, I'll confess, I get a little tired sometimes when I end up being like the authority on we've got to call, we've got to call, I feel like the koshering rabbi, right? Like we've got to call him over here and make sure everything's, kosher in this place. Like, okay, well, 6 of one, half dozen the other, but that process, I think, has expanded in the 10 years that I've been here, because we do have organizations like First Capital Pride that have this tremendous diversity of experience and people and real community that's formed around, helping youth and young adults live into their identity, helping parents understand how they can support their children, helping seniors, right? LGBT seniors are a thing. Right? We have a lot of LGBT seniors in nursing facilities, which folk don't think about that whole process.
Right.
What does it look like to be LGBT and to possibly lose some of your physical freedom or your physical agency, and then be in a space where you might be around somebody who really does not like you because of your identity? Right? That's a scary place for some of our elders. And some of these folk have lived through some really horrendous times. Like they have lived through the criminalization of our identities and the criminalization of who we are. And now they're in places where, depending on who the night shift nurse is, they might not be able to sleep that easy at night, right?
Right.
All of these are the broad, diverse experiences that we have, in this county, in this space. And people ask me, well, how many queer people really are there in Ross County? And I'm like, well, let me get the directory out. We've got the book. But like when you think about LGBTQ experience, the rough number is about 10% of folk will openly identify as part of the LGBTQ community. But demographically, we know that Ross County is a social cultural hub county. That is, people who do not feel comfortable being in whatever way, whether it's LGBTQ, whether it's women in certain professions, whether it's persons of color, in counties that are around Ross County, they will naturally gravitate to Ross County. So those numbers typically increase, right? We have a higher percentage of people who are people of color in this county than counties around us, a higher percentage of women professionals. We also have a higher percentage of LGBTQ persons. So you think about 77,000 people in Ross County, right? Start to do the math. I love math, right? Back to the biochemistry, right? Ralphie Hall, fellow of chemistry, right? If we're looking at the 10% number, you're looking at 7,600 people. It is not out of the ballpark to estimate that you're looking at about 10,000 residents of Ross County who are LGBTQ. And that's a statistic based upon reporting. Mm-hmm. So now you start thinking like 1 in 7 people. It becomes a different experience when you realize that we are here. We are, neighbors. We are your friends. We're the people at your church, whether your church likes it or not, right? Like that's who we are. That's where we are. We don't have to break anybody open intellectually or emotionally to understand that you've already been here, right? It's like the question about transgender bathroom, problems. Folk have used the bathroom next to transgender people already.
Yeah.
And let me tell you, every bathroom I have ever gone in, my number one concern has been, will there be toilet paper? Right? I am not interested in looking under the stall, over the stall, into the next. Like, I don't care who's there.
Right.
Is there toilet paper? Is the thing clean? Is there soap on the outside?
Right. Yeah.
Right? I've got some basic concerns about bathrooms, and who's doing whatever in the next stall is not it. Right?
Yeah.
Again, I am a simple man. I also grew up with, I like to tell people, I grew up with gender neutral bathrooms because my grandmother's outhouse was used by everybody, right? I mean, that's kind of where it is.
Yeah.
Gone far afield, though.
Well, I will also say first of all, this was a fascinating conversation. And I
agree.
I very appreciate the fact that you came in. I also wanted to comment that you are the only person to tell a story about rutabagas that I ever found fascinating. And if you missed it, at the city council meeting not too long ago where Terry spoke in favor of both John Gabus and Seal Corcoran, he told a story about Seal Corcoran and rutabagas that had to do with some shipment of food that they got from, I think, Minute Ohio Food Bank, in which they got a bunch of rutabagas, and it was probably going to be hinged on the future deliveries were going to be hinged on whether they could get rid of these rutabagas or not. And Terry ran out of time, I think, but he told that story. And again, it's the only story about rutabagas I've ever enjoyed. So I really appreciate that.
I've got to tell you though, that experience of Seal Corcoran hawking rutabagas to anybody and everybody because she cared so much about the health of this community. I've got to say, beyond the politics of it, beyond, any process of it, when I think about John Gabus and Seal Corcoran, I'm so proud of both of those people being in this community because they care deeply about this community. Their commitment to this community is unquestionable over the years. And John Gabus, I don't think, has hawked rutabagas all over the county, but
Nope.
John has done equally remarkable things for and with hundreds and hundreds, thousands of people in this community. Those people are the folk that I look to for my inspiration in this space. And it's part of why I love being in this community, because there are superheroes like that walking around every single day with these invisible capes, right? That you're never going to know about till somebody stands up and tells you about their rutabagas. Right?
Yeah. Well, you're one of them though, too. I mean, I really think you're out there doing God's work, and I really appreciate that.
It. Yeah, I was going to go back to, I've kind of been quiet through this whole, just kind of locked in on this conversation. I think it's been fantastic. But I go back to one of the first things you said when you were talking about your college experience and your gifts came out, and you can't run from your calling. And I think it's just important. This isn't a question. This is just more of a statement. It's so good to see how you've taken your calling and made an impact on a community that desperately needed that voice, and to help give others, like Mike said, to be able to articulate some of these things. Like we get sometimes to get tough questions, and I don't know how to answer them, but then I hear somebody like you speak and give me words to help me with the way I believe and the way I think and my thoughts that I just can't really put my language around. And it's just great to hear people that just so care about Chillicothe and Ross County and the people of this community, that you're willing to just be out there, saying these things, saying the right things, and just helping people better understand, what's going on in the community and what's worth fighting for. Yep. Yeah. So thank you.
I appreciate that. My boss is a Jewish carpenter. And I tell people, they say, why do you do what you do? I said, Jesus Christ sought me and found me when no one else wanted me. And when I look out into the world and I think about, I get up in the morning and I think, what can I do today that can benefit people for years after I'm gone, because I'm not going to be here very long, right? None of us are. I think about, who can I seek that no one else is seeking? Who can I try to find that no one else cares to find right now? Because those are the people who Jesus has sent us for, right?
Sure.
And, however we can do that, however we're able to do that, I think that's really our goal, particularly in this community. We've got to find people and help them in this space, make sure that this really does feel like home.
Yep.
Right.
Well, Terry, again, thank you very much for this time. Keep doing what you're doing. I think it's working. I think people are finding themselves in a better place because you're doing, you number one, you care.
Yeah.
And then number two, you're being human and you're being personable. And, I think that's a very, very good quality in our community and our culture today. So thank you very much.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
You're listening to the Feels Like Home podcast with Mike Throne and Marty Ford. Powered by Horizon. This is big. This is gig.
It feels a little strange, but I don't feel alone. We just settled in and it already feels